So as he said, I'm Zachary Lamb. I'm a doctoral student at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And my current research focuses on the spatial politics of urban flood infrastructure and climate adaptation in two flood vulnerable river delta cities, in New Orleans and in Dhaka. So today I'm going to present a thin slice of the work on Dhaka, and the recent history of Dhaka's flood protection and land use planning. The work investigates how state actors aligned with international lenders and donors have contributed to the city's landscape of radically uneven urban vulnerability, both through acts of omission and through acts of commission. Though Dhaka sits at the heart of the Bengal Delta and is subject to both river flooding and monsoon rain flooding, for most of the city's 400-year history, it didn't have any major flood control structures, but rather relied on distributed landscape and architectural strategies to manage urban water. So the story of Dhaka's modern flood infrastructure and urbanization can be divided into two episodes, both spatially and temporally. So the more urbanized western portion of the city was encircled by flood embankments in the late 1980s after two successive years of heavy flooding. The structures were built by the military regime and were later reinforced with support from the international donors under the Massive Flood Action Plan program. The Flood Action Plan also called for a similar arrangement around the less urbanized lower-lying eastern portion of the city, but these embankments were never built. So in western Dhaka, the embankments extend along the Turag and Buriganga rivers to protect the core of the city. When the embankments were planned, it was intended that they would be both a sort of pristine infrastructural corridor right-of-way with a 50-meter buffer on either side, and that they would act as a sort of edge of urbanization. The image in the upper left here shows the western fringe of New Orleans, my other site, where the levees do form the sort of stark edge, a divide between inside and outside, between wet and dry, between urban and wild. In Dhaka, planners expected something similar when they built their embankments. They expected that people would rush to the engineered safety of the embankments and abandon flood-prone lands on the outside of protection. However, as you can see in the image on the right, the western embankment and the road on its top serve not as an edge, but as a spine of urbanization. Since its construction, the embankment has become a major urban corridor, spreading development both inside and outside of the zone of protection. Much of this development has taken place in low-lying areas designated for water retention inside the embankments and for flood flow zones outside the embankments, placing many thousands of mostly low-income people at risk. So if Western Dhaka demonstrates how flood infrastructure without land use controls can generate uneven risk through unintended urbanization, maybe the answer is just not to build embankments. Unfortunately, Eastern Dhaka shows that the absence of state infrastructure can also lead to devastating consequences. Through these four mechanisms, which I won't explain here, but you can check out my poster, the lack of embankments in Eastern Dhaka has facilitated a form of what I call strongman urbanization. With no infrastructural protections and no effective land use controls, developers are privatizing flood risk mitigation by illegally grabbing land and placing millions of cubic meters of river sand to transform former wetlands into residential development plots. Through both direct and indirect violence, this process is displacing existing agricultural and fisheries-based communities at the urban fringe, frequently with no compensation. Both in Dhaka and other cities around the world, there's an urgent need for infrastructure and land use planning to address rapid urbanization and climate change. This research points towards the need to develop new modes of collective action and participatory planning planning and design that can address these concerns while avoiding the unintended consequences of both heavy-handed infrastructure based on flawed assumptions on the one hand, and privatization and state retrenchment on the other hand. Thank you.